And obviously the way this movie is meant to be seen, this festival is about showing action the biggest way possible, the best way possible. We've noticed that a lot of our press and reviewers have caught on that we are very, very proud of our exhibition. We take it really seriously. So we'd like to mention and say thank you to Sony for actually going out of their way to get us a real DCP of the movie and not play it off the Blu-ray. We have not had to turn to a Blu-ray in our 4 years of making the festival, and we don't want to do it now. So we appreciate everyone's efforts.
It's not often that you get three huge action legends all in one movie, especially not one as experimental and aggressive as this one. And so we're about to have a really lively conversation about how that all came about and how that sausage got made. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Brandon Streussnig.
Brandon.
It's a long
And his brother Brian.
I'm Brandon's clone, Brian. And please join me in giving a huge round of applause to director John Hyams.
Thanks everybody for watching this and sticking around.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So,
By the way, that was the R-rated version. I
yes, there's a head explosion in that sporting goods store that we didn't see. Yeah,
there was a few heads in there.
Well, so the first kind of thing that I want to ask you is that I always think about this when I watch this movie is it feels almost crazy to go to my friends who aren't as locked in on these kind of movies and be like, no, I promise you, the fourth Universal Soldier movie is like art house action. So we all love Dolph, JCVD, and Scott Adkins movies. They make a ton of great movies, but they've never made anything like this. So was there a moment when you approached them with this story and what your vision was? Were any of them like, what the fuck? It's like, I can't imagine like processing that.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, the first incarnation of this actually, I think, to be fair, JC was down with it. I think after we did Universal Soldier Regeneration before this, which doesn't go quite as far into like surreal territory maybe as this one. But I think he was happy to go along with whatever we dreamed up. The first incarnation of this script was really, really different, and much more. It was all kind of from the point of view, in the same way, from the point of view of a clone, but a very different, I guess you could just say a much more minimalistic, and it was almost like the movie that would be made after this, in a sense, and timeline-wise, like it pushed a little forward in the future. And I remember I first sent that to Dolph, and he was not feeling it at all, and there was a bunch of discussion. Then he kind of submitted an idea of his own that was much more almost like an older Universal, like there's a problem, bring in Universal Soldiers, they solve it. I wasn't interested in that version, so I said, all right, let's take some time and we'll figure a new one out. At that time, the producer, Moshe Diamant, he had like him and kind of partnered with Joel Silver and a guy named Courtney Solomon, had a little operation going on in Baton Rouge where they were making a series of like low budget action and horror movies. So they said, we'll just put you on one of those and that'll keep you down here and just write a whole new script. So I went and kind of directed one of those, which was this movie Dragon Eyes, and in the meantime, kind of came up with what ended up being this story, which still, when you look at the final result of it, it's still pretty far off of, it's still a big kind of left turn from regeneration, yeah. But I think once we got into this, Dolph was happy with this kind of version of it. And I think everyone was, but it was a bit of a negotiation for everyone. And then I think when I finally delivered it to Sony, I think they were pretty mortified.
Well, the other big thing with this movie is that it's a genuine passing of the torch from Jean-Claude to Scott, and Dolph in some ways to Scott. And what I find so cool about that is we got to see sort of yesterday Scott's like breakout film with Undisputed 2, and then today we're seeing like the passing of the torch, like this is the new guy. I feel like that's a hard thing in action to really have happen, because you hear about all the egos of the stars. You know, there's like a lot of big franchise stars who like won't lose fights. That's very famous with, you know, that sort of thing. Was it a struggle at all to sort of have, because it's very egoless what Dolph and Jean-Claude do in this movie.
Yes.
And was that a struggle at all, or were they on board from the ego?
Well, I think my feeling going into it was I didn't want to just do the same thing that we'd done last time. They'd obviously done a series of movies before I was involved where they had explored those characters as protagonists. And I had a strong feeling, even from my original script that I'd submitted, was that you needed to introduce someone new to the equation and not just as a foil. And I think because I felt like I wanted to tell a story that was almost like film noir kind of structure, where it's an amnesia story, right? You have a protagonist, and it turns out, I mean, that coming from the idea that I wanted to tell it from the perspective of the monsters, right? So if you have a guy, and the story will be a discovery of what he is, and by doing that, it meant that Jean-Claude's character and Dolph's character had to be more supporting characters to that, and that's how I presented it to Jean-Claude was, you know, we need your character, Luke Devereaux, to be a presence throughout. So we'll make a structure about a guy going to kill him, and then it becomes this journey, and your character will kind of play throughout, and then it's about showdown at the end. But yeah, in discussing the idea of one guy, that Jean-Claude, getting killed in the movie, we talked about it back and forth, and I think that's where we arrived at the idea. You know, the whole story is kind of about the futility of revenge, and even in many ways these kind of, if the story is a Frankenstein myth, right? But you've created machines, instruments of destruction, and essentially a slave race of living, breathing humans who are just there to fight. So if regeneration was about what happens when the war ends, you know, the warriors are still just going to be fighting. They're going to be looking for a war, and they'll fight against each other, and then ultimately against humanity. In this one, it felt important, and I think that's how we arrived at the end, that Devereaux, in a sense, decides that if I sacrifice myself, I've unleashed this guy on the world, and that's even more powerful than him moving forward. So I think that was, you know, I think to his credit, he liked that idea.
Well, it's funny, you know, this isn't a question really, but it's, I talked to someone, you know, my friend Mike down here, and my girlfriend pointed it out while we sort of whispered it while we were watching. This was the first time I was watching this movie where I was like, wow, this really is from the perspective of like a bad person, like he is the villain of the movie. And I've always sort of put that together in my head, but this is the first time where I really lasered in on that. That's a really sort of brave thing to do with this sort of movie. So how on board was Scott to play that kind of character?
Well, I mean, you could say he's the villain, but I would say the villains are the creators, right?
Yes.
And so, in a sense, he's just a guy on a revenge tear, and he's going to do, and I think that's what the ending. That was, I think, the fun of the ending is like, this is like it. It's like this is a version of my version of Oppenheimer, let's say. So if the once that was, to me, if you could do it in a very minimalistic way, saying that once they've crossed that threshold, now all bets are off.
Yeah.
If a guy, if the story is about a guy who has memories of a wife and family, but also the grief of their death, but he chooses the memories of them over living in the real world and having them erased. And as long as he has those memories, well, he's just going to work his way up the chain of command, essentially.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea.
So this is an action festival, so there's another name in this movie that I think a lot of people here are big fans of outside of the three leads, and that's Larnell Stovall.
Yeah,
who,
absolutely.
So you worked with him on Dragon Eyes, if I'm not mistaken.
No, Larnell did not do Dragon Eyes, but we were the original. Originally when we were going down the road on this, and I was telling this story just out there. Originally, I met J.J. Perry for this.
Yeah.
And J.J. showed me a previs that had been essentially a previs that had been for a major action star that had been rejected. And so he showed this to me, and those 8711 guys pretty much have like revolutionized the previs, right? Their previses were incredible with sound effects and what everyone does now, but back then everyone wasn't doing the such detailed, well-crafted, well-directed previses. And he showed me this thing that at the time they were calling like gun jitsu, which is just like close quarters combat with guns, shooting in the face, basically everything you see in John Wick. And I saw this and I thought, my God, that got rejected? This is incredible. And I was like, well, that's what we want to do, stuff like that, among other things. And then schedules didn't align. JJ got a job, so then he recommended Larnell. And then I started meeting Larnell over a period of time, talking about this, and he's really he's truly the architect of the action in that movie.
Well, I don't know where I read that he was. I must have misread his filmography. But anyway, talk to me a little bit about crafting the action with him, because you've made some horror movies, and this feels of a piece with those. I think when people watch your horror movies too, there's some action elements in those kills. I guess set pieces aren't dissimilar in horror in action in a way. So can you tell me a little bit about just crafting that action with him and just making it, because you mentioned the John Wick guys, and I won't let you say it, but I'll say it. Rewatching this, I think they owe you a lot of money because a lot of the stuff you see in John Wick is very in debt to this kind of thing.
Well, I think to that point, this is something, to be fair, that they had been working on, that kind of stuff. I think my feeling about action and my taste in it is I like action to feel grounded. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful stuff that you all have probably seen this weekend that is more stylized, and that stuff's amazing. And I love to watch that stuff. But my taste in terms of executing is that I try to make it feel like everything has impact, and that it's kind of lives in a world with gravity. Now, the opportunity when you're doing Universal Soldier, where you're doing kind of superhuman characters, that allowed for the kind of stuff that Larnell specializes in. And so we had a lot of talks about, yes, we want these characters to be doing stuff that is extraordinary and not totally earthbound, but it can't be let's just say everything still has to have impact. I'll always sacrifice kind of something that is I'll sacrifice acrobatics for just impact. And so I think Larnell understood that, and Scott understood that. I mean, Scott is a very smart guy with this stuff too. He has a director's mind when it comes to action and how it plays. So the two of them were really my closest kind of collaborators on all the action set pieces, and Chuck Picerni for the car work. And I think, I think ultimately what Larnell really brought to the table, which I thought was really impressive, is that for him every action scene, every fight has a narrative in and of itself. And so he really would trace kind of all the beats and movements and the story that's being told in each fight. And it was an education working with him.
Well, and then out in the lobby, there's a copy of this movie for sale that is the 3D version, and I want to ask about that because we didn't get to see that here. But how did that come about? Because I still haven't seen this in 3D, and I can't imagine this in 3D.
Yeah, that was something that was like forced upon us. That was like back in 2011 or whenever that was. There was this idea of selling 3D worldwide and how that became this selling point. So the producer, Moshe Dimant, said, check out 3D. Our budget was limited, it was a lower budget, which a lot of the budget informed the type of story. We didn't have the ability to execute mass scale. So it had that already dictated that it had to be more of a thriller than just a straight up action movie. But he said, try out the 3D, see if you can do it. I think we had like $8 million or something like that, which $8 million, once you've paid everybody off, all the rights holders, our shooting budget was 3.5.
Jesus.
So,
that car chase, wow.
So yeah, you're really just like parsing out every penny of that. And so I said, I don't think we can do 3D for this budget. He's like, check it out. I went, met with the guys, looked at the rigs, tried them out, talked to a bunch of people, and I came back and I said, yeah, we can't do it in 3D. We got to do it in 2D. We can't afford it. And he said, I already sold it to Germany and Japan in 3D. And I said, and then I said, well, then I'm out. And I walked out of his office, got in a car, drove, pissed off, called my manager or whoever, and then drove for a while. And then I was like, fuck, and I'm like, what am I gonna do now? So I turned around and went back. I'm like, okay, fine. And we had to shoot it in 3D, which is way more complicated than just doing it as a post-conversion. So shooting in 3D meant that, there's a lot of, there's obviously a great deal of that movie is shot on Steadicam, is shot handheld, and that's basically, our camera operator is a really big, strong guy named Nick Davidoff, who's a great camera operator, who's essentially holding 75 pounds of camera equipment in all of that. And yeah, you just needed someone who could handle the weight of that. But to an aesthetic point, Yaron Levy, our DP, and myself, we said, look, if we're gonna shoot it in 3D, we want to do it well in 3D, but it's also gotta work in 2D. So that kind of informed lens choices. We didn't want to shoot it long lens because really long lens stuff in 3D just ends up looking like a pop-up book, right? Like flat, plain. So if you go with slightly wider lenses, then you're bringing in the environment more, and then you're placing these characters, you're feeling the environment you're in. So I haven't personally seen it in 3D since we color corrected it, but I think we did. It does work nicely in 3D because we did, try to make sure that it worked for that.
I do want to do a quick check on time. How are we? Okay, cool. You mentioned to me when we were talking before the movie that I've seen people describe this, and I think this is a very overused term, but I do think it's a little apt here. I've seen people describe it as Lynchian, and I think sometimes that's just like, oh, it's surreal, so it's Lynchian. But what you said that you were watching while making this was Gaspar Noé. Can you tell me a little bit about how he and Enter the Void specifically sort of influenced it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I have to admit, like in some ways, it was just downright theft what I was doing, because I've been watching his films. I'm a huge admirer of his work, and Enter the Void, I don't remember exactly when it came out, but I remember when we were prepping this, because so much of this movie, I wanted all the memories to be first-person POV. And so how do you execute that beyond just, moving a camera around? And what Gaspar, does in that movie, Enter the Void, is, he, again, something I sort of took from him and I think did an interpretation, but he has like eye blinks and things like that. So I wanted to live in this kind of strobe-y, almost amorphous level of clarity, and really try and get into the feeling of memory. A lot of that was the way our sound designers, Neil Fazzari, how we used audio during that stuff. But I think Gaspar Noé creates just incredibly visceral experiences. Again, what he does with audio, what we did with kind of the strobing here, which is, watching it now, I'm like, it goes to the point of maybe too extreme. But we really wanted to put you through the experience, and that's something I take away. I remember in my office, I had a TV there, and I just would have Enter the Void on all the time, almost like an endless loop, because I think it's a masterpiece.
Well, I guess as we wrap here, you mentioned that there's a version of this movie that felt a little further ahead in the future that's maybe a little more silent. And so how experimental, like, if you had the opportunity to do 5, what's that look like in, maybe a log line?
Yeah, I think, in many ways, I took a lot of those ideas and they ended up in this, so I wouldn't be able to do like that script, because that script ended up, I mined a lot of that script for this. Like, funny enough, that sporting goods store fight was in that original script. But I don't know what it looks like on the page, but it's, but the idea of that, I think the original script was like very light on dialogue. It was a very, very minimal in dialogue and very sort of action journey driven. So there was a time shortly after this when we started talking about another, and we had come up with a concept that looked a little further into the future about this kind of this revolution that would be going on. So at the time, that seemed like a pretty cool idea, but I guess if there was another one, maybe we would look back at what we came up with there.
Well, I feel like the next step, they force 3D on you. The next step, that's Universal Soldier 5 in 4DX. I feel like that's right. Well, thank you so much, John.
Thank you,
and please give him another huge round of applause.